The structure of this talk is going to be, I'll take you through a bunch of things that you should probably think about if you're making a game with characters and dialogue in. And then there's an exercise at the end that you can take away and do, which will help you build up some skills in this area if you don't already have them. So we're going to go through a bit of theory. We're going to go through some practical considerations in this area when we talk about characterization and dialogue, and then little exercise at the end, and then kind of an open Q&A like we always do on a stream, really. And we're also thinking about narrative design here. So if you haven't heard this term before, it's a term that sort of games writers have taken on in the last sort of 10 or 20 years to help us think about the relationship between game design and writing, and it not just being someone says there will be cutscenes and then a writer comes in and writes the cutscenes. It's thinking about the narrative as a bit more integrated with the game design. So that's where this term comes from. In terms of like my background and experience with this, my first studio job in my late 20s, I did a bunch of the writing on Amateur Surgeon 4, which was kind of writing cutscenes. I've done a bunch of weird experimental narrative stuff before. There used to be a bot on Twitter called Strange Voyage. It was like a generative story bot that I made, and some weird twine games like this one down here, which was like a cyberpunk game where you're scanning people's brains and then interpreting haiku that came out of their brains and deciding what brain disease they had based on that. During my sort of more academic teaching career when I was at Christchurch, I developed the narrative design module there. So when students had finished their first year and they got to choose their electives, and if they chose narrative, they got a module with me where we did narrative for a whole semester. So that's kind of my background. I won't go into this too much, but you know, sometimes when someone's new, they want to go, who's this person and why are they teaching me this stuff? But because we are indie game developers, I'm going to be going through some of the literature on narrative and some of the stuff that comes from books about game narrative, and then making sure we think about it in a kind of practical sense of what's actually practical to do as a small-time developer, because I feel like that's an element that often gets missed out. We kind of use AAA examples or we analyze high indie games, and then we don't think about whether it's like a relevant example for us to use as a developer. So we're going to be thinking about characters and characterization. What sort of things do we need to think about in order to make characters who feel believable? And maybe believability isn't always the goal. Maybe there are other goals that we have for our characters depending on what sort of game we're making and that sort of thing. So lots of things to sort of take away and think about in relation to your own work. And the second one, the exercise I'm going to give you towards the end, is writing an argument. So I think this is a really good exercise to do if you are making a dialogue-driven game. It's also a good exercise to do to help you figure out stuff about your game world, even if you don't intend to put the argument in the game itself. This is quite a helpful exercise. You don't have to do it. I've always found it kind of helpful, and people have found it helpful with their own projects when they've done it. So that will come up at the end of this. Before we get onto the specifics of talking about characters, there are obviously a bunch of different things to think about in terms of game narrative design, and we're focusing mostly on characters today. Who are they? What do they think? Why should we care about them? If you're making characters in a game, you want players to have some sort of emotional reaction to them. You want players to care about them and want to protect them or hate them and want to destroy them. You don't want a bunch of beige characters that don't provoke some sort of feelings. And then we've got locations. And we're going to tie these together a little bit when we come to that argument exercise at the end, because we're going to think about what do characters think about the world they're in and stuff. But obviously, the whole idea of environmental storytelling and the history of a world is a whole other topic that we can do a whole other workshop on at some point. So we're going to be less focused on this today. And then the last category here that I think is perhaps one of the most important ones for game designers to think of, but maybe not the focus for today, is, you know, you should always be thinking about all of the ways that your game can tell a story that don't involve these things, right? Films have characters and locations, radio plays have characters and locations, books have them, but games have a bunch of different narrative devices that don't exist in other media, like flavor text and things like that. So we're going to talk in a minute about the practicality of adding characters and dialogue to a game and the sort of issues it can raise for a developer, particularly if you're not a writer as well. And that's why it's always important to be thinking of, like, what other storytelling tools and techniques can you get out of your game's mechanics and its interface? And this third thing is not really the focus of this talk, but by the time we finished talking about characters and writing dialogue, it might kind of push you away from writing characters and thinking more about this kind of stuff, or like, how can I tell a story mainly through my gameplay and my location, rather than, adding dialogue where I don't feel confident in adding dialogue and so on. And then we've got these more practical considerations that everyone needs to think about, really, if you're thinking of making games or you're making games currently. The first one, and this is the stuff they often don't really cover in books on narrative design, is the implementation workload. So when you come up with a narrative approach of saying, oh, we're going to have text boxes that come up and dialogue options or whatever, how much work does that make for you, right, in terms of technical implementation? Having characters that speak to you is one level of complexity. Being able to answer them back is another layer of complexity. Being able to answer them back and then have them remember stuff and have them care and respond to what you said, that's another layer of complexity, right? And we might just be at a stage of using our game engine or whatever where the thing we want to do with narrative is not there for us. And it might be that you end up looking up like middleware or, modules people have written. So I've worked with some people on a Unity game recently, and they wanted a visual novel section, and we ended up kind of buying a license for a pre-created set of UI and stuff for visual novels within Unity. So those are considerations. If you're dreaming up a game and you haven't really sat down and programmed it yet, all of the stuff about your narrative approach and how you tell your story is going to create you more work as a developer. So that's worth thinking about. And then over here in the pink text, we've got your storytelling career. By this, I'm thinking, how many times have you written down a story, whether it's for a game or anything else? Have you written anything before? And do you know how to write a story? Are you making use of skills you've practiced before, or are you learning completely new ones? Because if you're suddenly having to write in a mode you've never written in before, that could be a really fun thing to learn. But the fact that it's a new thing to learn could also be something you want to consider and maybe limit how much of it is. Because this is going to sound very negative, but let's say you're very good at programming action games and you make a fantastic action game, and then you decide to inject all this story in it, but you've never really written a story before, you've never really written dialogue or whatever it is, and maybe you don't have the skills to judge whether it's good or not. And all of that effort you put into adding that element might make the thing you're making worse in some way, introducing more problems to your games or making it weaker in one area. So these kind of 5 things are like the broad things about storytelling in games that I think everyone should consider before they even decide that their game's going to have a story, And then there's this other aspect of the relationship between the technology and the storytelling is the tools that you use, or the tools that you're learning to use, are going to shape what type of story it's easy to tell. So as our examples here, I've got Twine, which is a prose engine. I've got Ren'Py, which is mostly for writing interactive dialogue. And then the Unreal Robot Man standing in a field. If I'm using something like Unreal or Unity, and I'm using a 3D engine and I'm making a game set in an environment, then it feels like the storytelling in my game is naturally going to lean towards environmental storytelling and putting things in the environment to tell a story. The difference between Twine and Ren'Py is an interesting one. I don't know if anyone in the chat has used either of these before. A lot of narrative design courses will start people off on Twine because they think it's simpler because it doesn't have art. But in order to be able to make a good Twine, you basically have to be able to write quite well because it's in prose. You wake up in the morning and the sunlight streams through the window and you think about your life, blah, blah, blah. The kind of text-based interactive fiction sort of assumes that that's the main thing you're doing, right? When I used to teach this course at university, I started students off in Ren'Py because then they would be focusing entirely on making characters and making them speak to each other and to the player. And that is an easier place to start because you can just think about how real people speak. You're not having to think about the narrative voice of a book, which is kind of what you have to do if you're writing in Twine. And the other thing is, if you focus first on writing character dialogue, that is a form of writing that is much more transferable to other forms of games, right? Because nearly every game with characters in has characters speaking to each other. But most games do not have like book style prose in unless it's a very specific type of game. These are all, again, just broad things to consider that aren't necessarily to do with the main topic today, but I thought it might be worth thinking about them up front. So part one, what even are characters? When we look at a piece of fiction and we see characters in it, it's just like, oh, there's a little guy and he's in the screen. There's a person in the screen. That's a character, right? What I want us to focus on here is characterization as a process. Because when we talk about characterization, the idea behind that is that the author or authors have made deliberate choices to create a character. And the more that we pay attention to those deliberate choices, the easier it will become to make them for ourselves. Great quote by Mike Baal, 2009 book on narratology, the study of narrative. Character is not a human being, but it resembles one. It has no real psyche, personality, ideology, or competence to act, but it does possess characteristics that make readers assume it does. As creatives, making narrative media with characters in, we are doing characterization in order to make our readers or our audience feel like this character on the screen has these qualities of a real person, right? We want them to feel like this is a person with a psyche, their own brain and personality, their own belief system, their own kind of desire to do things and ability to do things. But we have to do that through a process of characterization. Video games put us in a weird situation when it comes to characters, because we have these things that look like humans, but they are missing lots of the qualities of characters. You've got characters like Trevor from GTA 5 over here. He has his own sort of behaviors and personality that are completely independent from anything the player does. And that means he's a character in the narrative sense that we would call a character in a movie or a book or whatever. And then at the other end of the scale, we've got, they walk around like a person, but we don't really know anything about their personality or anything like that. So I've put Chell from Portal as an example of this. You know, we would call it a character because that's generally what we call people in media, but it doesn't have a personality, and it's there for us to sort of move around as a vehicle. And then in the middle, you've got someone like Shep from Mass Effect, where you've got a bit of both qualities. You know, they have a bit of their own personality, but it's a kind of a bit defined by players' choices. There's a bit of a limitation on that where they say, right, you know, this character is not going to do anything massively evil. That's kind of within the limits of what a good space captain should do, right? You get some choices, but none of them really take you outside of this kind of rough idea of what they have for the character. So it's a continuum. And that means that we have characters with a high level of characterization, characters where we have this sort of flexible characterization where the player picks and chooses different traits, and then characters where there's not actually much characterization of them in the game, and if we want it, we sort of have to make it up in our own head. This actually was taken from like a teen English literature syllabus I got this from in the UK. Elements of characterization we've got here, we've got physical appearance, the background, like where the character comes from, and then if you think of Shepard in Mass Effect, we get to choose their background, we get some different background choices, and we can decide if they're like a street kid or I can't remember what the other ones are, but that's going to define something about the character. If you are making like a fantasy game or a sci-fi game, the background of the character is going to tie into your world building in some way, right? They are a dwarf who hates elves, that kind of thing. And that's a good way to sort of tie the things the characters care about to the world that you want players to invest in. We've got personality, which is, you know, their psyche, how they respond to different things, how they feel about different things, the kind of patterns of how they think that come out through their speech and behavior, which is down here as another point. We've got their relationships with other characters, their motivation, what they want, what they're trying to do. And the motivations of characters are often what lead us into conflicts and interchange as well. You'll often hear writers talk about how, you know, characters need to change throughout stories, or they need to at least be trying to change in some way, because that is where we get the conflict that makes the story interesting. And one of the things you can do to make your story most interesting is have characters that share some motivations and clash on others, right? So a classic example of this would be a Dungeons and Dragons party where everyone is agreed that they need to go and stop the evil Baron, but members of the party have different approaches or different ideas about what is the correct way to do that. So We've got our 8 elements of a character, and one of the things I want us to think about is this stuff in relation to player characters. We've got 4 types of player character here, and if you're wondering how useful is this to a game developer, and I would say a useful way to use this framework, I'm going to go through and describe what these mean in a minute, but a useful way to think of this is, in your game, have you actually nailed down what your player character is out of these 4 categories? Because if you're making a game with a player character in at the moment and you're sort of hovering between these categories, you might find that your game is confusing because it's not consistent about its approach to the player character and do they have a personality, do they speak, or are they Gordon Freeman? So, our 4 types of player character that you can have. The first one is a cipher. It's a character that has no discernible personality. They're a blank slate. And you might look at little Foxy Pants from Tunic and think, well, they have a personality. They have personality in their animation and how they're presented and stuff. But really, we mean in terms of the narrative and like how they talk, really. You can have an animation that has personality in it, but still have a character that doesn't necessarily have a personality. These characters have no clear motivations or desires, or if they do, we have to infer them. They're not stated in any way, and players bring them to life with their own imaginations. Here, I think it's really important to understand that when we say these characters have no personality, it's not a criticism. It's just a sort of classification of how these work in the narrative. I think in any other medium, we would think that saying a character has no personality would be a bad thing. But we can probably think of how Tunic and Half-Life are improved by this fact in some way. I haven't played Tunic. I know it has a lot of puzzling in it. And I know Half-Life has a lot of puzzling in it. And I think the fact that the character doesn't do what the characters in God of War do and sort of go, hey, I think this is a puzzle. And I think that kind of adds to how these games feel, right? Because Half-Life has a lot of sort of environmental physics puzzles in and stuff. And Tunic has a bunch of puzzles. And these are games that want you to work things out for yourself and feel smart. So I think when we think about the relationship between the style of game and the choices about the protagonist, we can start to think that, well, no personality or at least no voice actually does something positive in the context of this game, because it allows the voice that's in the head of the player as they're working things out to be more important than a character on the screen. The main point here is you can have a main character with no personality, and that can be a good thing if it's in the right game context. Then we've got the fixed character, which is almost like the opposite end of the spectrum from the cipher, right? This is a character where the character is written by an author, and whatever you do in the game as a player is not going to change the personality of that character. You control them in action segments of the game, but the player is not controlling their personality. The player is not making decisions about who this person fundamentally is. If you're going to pull this off, if you're going to make a Madeline or an Alan Wake, and you're going to do it well, you probably need to be a really good writer, because you're not leaving much up to the imagination of the player. This route requires like a higher level of attention to the stuff we talked about earlier, like the different ways you characterize a character. And then we've got 2 more types. We've got the customizable character. Everything that this character does is a product of players' choices. And you can already start to think about how each of these categories has different things you have to do as a developer if you want to do it, right? Because this means we don't necessarily have to write a convincing character, because the player is going to make up their own character. But we do have to give them loads of options for how the character looks or how the character speaks or whatever. And then you've got this, where you have a customizable character with a fixed background. So this is a character that has some predefined achievements, probably a name and a role like Captain in Mass Effect, but players define how they look and behave, right? This is the one that BioWare does a lot. There's like a mix of stuff here in terms of how much of it is written and how much of it is up to the player to decide. But to think about these in a practical sense, each of them kind of requires different stuff from us as game developers. Right? If we make a character who's a cipher, I think if you go down this route of having a voiceless protagonist in your game, you can totally do that, but you need to think about what's appealing about them and the visual communication around that character and what that character represents. You know, is it a cute character we're supposed to care about? Is it like a edgy character that's supposed to feel cool to move around and destroy stuff with? There's so much more weight on that stuff because the character doesn't have a voice, right? So again, just going through these 4 categories that are quite abstract, and instead of just treating them as a taxonomy, trying to think about the pros and cons of using them as a developer. The fixed character, we need them to be appealing, and we need these characters to be well written, because we're asking the player to stop playing for a couple of minutes while they talk and they say stuff that the player has nothing to do with. Having this kind of character where they speak in cutscenes and everything, and that is not something where the player is getting to intervene and make choices, then there needs to be something inherently entertaining or moving about that character performance in some way. So again, this is going to be the most intensive one in terms of like traditional writing skills and being able to write good dialogue that makes people care about the character. So these are very, very opposite to each other. And you can almost say like, hey, if you can already write a game with a fixed character. If you can't write, but you can make cool looking stuff, maybe make a game with a cipher character. And then, as you can imagine, these 2 categories are going to need customization systems and content. So you remove some of the need for the character to be well written because the player is choosing dialogue options instead of the character speaking for themselves. But now you need to have like different trees of like backgrounds or whatever the system is in the game in order to support this sense of the player making choices about the character. So every one of these different protagonist types we can choose has pros and cons in terms of what you need to do as a developer to achieve it and make it work. Curriculus said, in customizable character games, the dialogue options still need to be well written. Yeah, and it's not something we're going to focus on today, and I'll probably do another session at some point in the future about player choice in game narrative. But good writing when it comes to player choices in games comes down to this thing. It's like player expression. You will see patterns in games of dialogue choices where, you know, in a Fallout game, it might be a lot of situations give you a nice option, a absolute asshole option, and then a like pragmatic option that's like, give me more money. And they will just kind of stick to that framework a lot of the time. And that is kind of helpful to players because they sort of know what to expect from those options. But depending on the type of game you're making, you might want like higher or lower levels of predictability. And if you're really going for social realism, for example, you might have characters that don't want you to keep asking them questions all the time, right? Whereas a traditional RPG, the dialogue trees are just there to sort of teach you about the world and the situation. Because most RPGs have quite predictable dialogue trees where it's like you get given a quest, you get the option to ask some questions about it. Most of those questions aren't really going to do anything except give you a bit more context around it. And there's usually an option that's just like, yeah, let's get on with it type thing. Whereas a game that's going for like more of a detective kind of scenario or more social realism might sort of reward or punish you for exploring the dialogue trees in different ways. It's definitely a whole topic for us to think about in a future workshop, I think. I'm going to do the midpoint plug now. This is the 2 minutes where I advertise some stuff. Midpoint plug. If you want me to help you one-to-one with anything to do with your game, I've got a new website, indiegameclinic.com, where you can find out about my private coaching services, where you can find out about my design consulting. So private coaching is you make your game and I help you. Design consulting is you make your game and also I make part of your game. And you can also find out about other stuff we do on this channel there, like Indies Under the Knife, and you can submit your game to that. We've also got a Discord community that you can join either through the Patreon or by supporting this channel as a channel member. And by doing that, you help support this channel so I can do more stuff like this. We have a very active Discord community with a very strong culture of mutual feedback. I'm on there most days. And most questions that people have about their games, I chip in and answer them if and when I can. We've built up a really nice culture in there of people feeding back on each other's games. People have like threads where they just come in every couple of days and post their progress and so on. And it's just nice to have a slightly more closed community than a subreddit or whatever, because you get to know people. And also I do a monthly playtest of just games from the Discord community. The next one of those is on April 29th. So if you're in the chat and you're already part of our Discord, maybe your game is going to be showing up in this one on April 29th. That's the midpoint plug. We can get on to part 2. How do characters speak? Let's think about dialogue in games. So when characters speak, how do they speak? And one of the first things I'd encourage you to think about is the overall tone of the game that you're going for and what the dialogue is for, right? So these are kind of 3 modes that I think games operate in a lot of the time. We've got something like Night in the Woods, where we're going for social realism and naturalism, which is like characters speaking like real people. They've got their own little quirks to how they speak. They've got a sort of kind of in-group language of how the young people speak to each other and stuff like that. They don't speak like characters in an epic quest or anything. I guess the opposite of that in terms of tone, you get this a lot in high fantasy, you get it a lot in dark fantasy and in epic sci-fi, the sort of theatrical melodramatic register where you've got a character who is talking like they are in a sort of Saturday morning kids TV show, right? Very over the top, not at all modeled on how people speak in the real world, more modeled on things like how characters speak in Shakespeare or Star Wars or anything like that. And of course, you can go between these, and it's often a source of great comedy to have like a character that is speaking in this theatrical melodramatic mode and then who sort of dips into saying something really normal and down to earth, right? You can jump between these modes, and sometimes that's very effective and very funny to do that. It's worth thinking about these sorts of things of like, does your game have an overall tone where everyone is always speaking like they are in a play? Or is this like a distinction between characters? Like maybe you've got a character that speaks more like they're in Night in the Woods and they're very down to earth, and then you have a character that speaks more like they're in Darkest Dungeon and they're completely over the top. That can be an interesting like distinction between characters as well. The other thing that complicates games specifically is we have this kind of stuff. This is a character that speaks, but they're not really a character. They are a tutorial being. So it introduces this other weird type of language that isn't really narrative. And that's why we need to think about the purpose of the dialogue, because this guy is just here to tell us how to play the game and to give us tips. Like, since I started doing reviews on this channel, I've definitely seen some situations where someone has tried to make the functional informative tutorial text have a bit more of a voice, and it just makes the game confusing because you can't tell when it's being tutorialized. And I think Darkest Dungeon is a good example of this. A lot of the tutorial text and the pop-ups and stuff are not actually written in this guy's voice, right? So you have a very dramatic kind of voice for all the narrative stuff in the game, but when the game is just telling you how to do combat or giving you strategic advice, it is in functional language. It's not in this kind of flowery dramatic language anymore. Another thing to think about is dialogue directionality, I've called it here. So played Moonshire a couple of weeks ago. This is a really good example of one-way dialogue where the player character doesn't speak, right? And we see this loads in old school JRPGs. You go up to characters in the world and the characters have stuff to say. This basically means, and if we think about it in terms of like development practicality, this means you get to write a little bit of dialogue for loads of different characters, and your player character can be a blank slate. And then in Celeste, player character does speak, but the player doesn't impact that in any way. The player character just speaks to characters in the world, and we don't have anything to do with that. And then in Mass Effect, we've got two-way dialogue between the player and characters in the world, and the player is actually sort of choosing how that plays out. And again, these are all going to give you a different feel. These are the two modes, I guess, of player-character dialogue in sort of action-adventure games. We can have a player character that speaks to characters, in which case, again, they have to be likable in a particular way. Or we can go the Moonshire route of silent protagonist, which is actually the Zelda route as well. Silent protagonist and characters in the world speak at them. So I'm not going to go through every single one of these things and say, here's how you can make sure your character speaks about their relationships. But you can kind of use it as a checklist, right? And imagine that a dialogue has, I don't know, 12 clicks in it in terms of like text boxes coming up. How many of these text boxes are doing more than one thing at once? Because that can be a good sign that you're packing a lot in. Jazz just mentioned that you can use the character text HUD and text speed to show personality for the characters. Yeah, and that's a really good example of like what I was talking about right at the beginning about making sure you're thinking about your game and genre and, you know, the affordances of video games that allow you to tell stories in different ways compared to other media, right? Because that kind of text animation thing gives us a sense of like a speech pattern. You can even have a different font for different characters, right? I wouldn't recommend doing it too much. Terry Pratchett used to do it in Discworld, where Death speaks in capital letters, right? And that kind of makes you read his voice in a particular voice in your head, even though you're just reading a book. This is a good exercise I've seen people describe for any kind of script writing. If you've got a script for a scene of dialogue in a game or any other kind of media, if you can redact the names of the characters and still tell who is who, then that's a good sign that the characters have different voices. This is an example from Friends. I don't think this is a very good example. The idea is that your characters will have different ways that they speak. You know, you might have one character that uses filler words more and says, kinda, a lot, right? Like I do. I think My Little Pony Friendship is Magic is a very good example of characters that speak very differently according to their personality. Welcome to Indie Brony Clinic, the channel where you can learn narrative design through My Little Pony. What's the really shy one? Fluttershy is the really shy one, right? Talks like Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh. Those are examples of characters that have very different speech patterns. So if you redacted the names in the script of Friendship is Magic, you very quickly be able to see who was speaking at which point. Okay. This is the exercise that I want you to do. And I can almost guarantee that by doing this, you will come away with a better sense of what you're trying to make and how it works. Now, you can actually do it in the game if you think it will be beneficial to do it. But this is a very particular type of exercise, and it may be that it's not actually relevant to your game in terms of the thing it produces. Lots of writing exercises are not about creating a scene to put into your movie, right? Like when you do character interviews for a book, that's not for you to use, it's just for you to understand the character. But let's say you're in a situation where you're not currently making a game and you want to practically do this. There are a couple of different approaches. You can do it as a traditional script where you write the characters' names down and then write out what they say. I know people that do this in spreadsheets now because it's just quicker and easier. Or you can use it as an excuse to go and dabble in Twine or Ren'Py and have your first dip into one of those things. If you're currently not working on a game and you're interested in making narrative games, I would say this is a really good excuse to just have your first hour of messing around in Twine or Ren'Py. And you can use any of these media, or you can just sit on the public transport and talk to yourself out loud and keep changing voices like Gollum, and you can freestyle it in a public place and people will back away from you slowly, or they'll arrest you and put you in some sort of secure facility. It's up to you. So the exercise sounds deceptively simple. It is to write a disagreement between two characters in your fictional world about your fictional world. Okay? So two characters in your world are arguing, and they're arguing about something in your fictional world. And they should be arguing about some interesting thing in your fictional world. They probably shouldn't be arguing about whether or not pineapple goes on pizza, right? Because that's not going to help you in the context of this exercise. Two characters from your world having an argument about something specific to your world, something defining about your world, something about your world that's different from our world. And I think you can probably already guess how this would be a helpful exercise, because it's going to make you think about a bunch of stuff. And what I want you to think about is all of these overlaps. Like the easy version of this task is just writing this conversation as if there's no player there, right? So the characters are arguing about something in the world, And through that argument, we're going to learn about these two characters and their relationship, and we're going to learn about the world and a disagreement that these characters have about the world, right? Because we've all had this experience of playing a game with a big lore dump, and we just think, I don't care about this world. Why are you telling me all this stuff, right? One of the best ways to make players care about your fictional world is to show how it matters to the characters. And one of the ways you can show how it matters to the characters is having them disagree on it, right? Some things to consider. How can we learn about the game world through the characters and their disagreements, right? So maybe our world has some big historical event that happened in the past and our characters disagree on it. Or maybe we have a character that just cares a lot about that and a character that doesn't and wants to move on. Or it could be something that's going on currently in your game world, the big war, or I guess if we go into cozy games territory, the big corporate supermarket moving into town. Some big thing going on in the game world and two characters disagreeing with that. Or it could be about the future of the world. It could be about a course of action. So the example that I gave earlier from a Dungeons and Dragons campaign where you've got characters who are on the same side. They loosely agree about what needs to be done, but they don't agree on how to do it, right? That's another example of two characters disagreeing about something in the world, right? We want two characters that are different from each other, and we want their personality to come out in this argument. So how do these characters argue differently, right? You might find this particularly cathartic if it gives you an opportunity to think about like how different people in your life communicate in different kinds of dysfunctional manners. Right? How do these characters argue differently? How do they approach this conflict differently? And what is their existing relationship? What are their relationships with other characters? What type of language does each character use? And the easy way to have characters that speak differently is just to have them have such different backgrounds that naturally they speak differently. Like a wizard is going to speak differently from a barbarian, right? You're doing this exercise to work out what those characters are. What about those characters do they share? And what about those characters is different from each other? And then sort of expressing their different viewpoints on the world through this argument as well. And like I said, the output of this, it could be game content, but it's more like this is like the writing equivalent of doing concept art. You're writing a scene, and you might not even be making a game that has these kind of scenes in it where characters speak to each other. But by writing this scene, you would kind of get to a better understanding of who your characters are, what's going on in your world. When you've got like a fantasy or sci-fi world that you've come up with, the lore or the big thing that's going on in the world is often not as inherently interesting to players as we'd think. And what tends to be more interesting about it is like the different interpretations of it available that the characters represent. So if you imagine X-Men, right? Think of X-Men. You've got a world conflict in that between humans and mutants, right? And that's a big point of the story. But the major conflict is really like the mutants' internal conflict about how do you approach that. There are different approaches. One is the kind of isolationist, let's go away from the world and we'll prove to the humans that we're safe and that we're helpful, which is what Professor Xavier represents. And then the sort of I guess, is it kind of fascist? I don't know what Magneto wants to do, which is to say, actually, we're better than humans and we shouldn't let them oppress us and we should fight them, right? If we think about the relationship between the world building there and the characters, the world building of there are mutants with superpowers is not inherently interesting. It's not where the narrative conflict comes from. The narrative conflict comes from the characters disagreeing about what to do about the world. Right? And that's where we get that interesting dynamic. So I hope this sort of makes sense as an activity you could go off and do, because I do think, like, regardless of what sort of game you're making, doing this sort of activity can really help give you a handle on the kind of world you're building as well as the characters that inhabit it. You can make your disagreement about pineapple pizza if you want, but it's not going to teach you as much about your game world, right? And like I said, this workshop was really focused on characters and what are characters and all the weird things we have to think about to make good characters in video games. And sometimes, that idea of the cipher, sometimes you want a character that doesn't talk and just gets out of the way so the player can inhabit them, you know? But this exercise gets you to start thinking about the relationship between the characters and the world and how do the characters fit into it.